Hello, I'm Lesley Hoskins. I work on the Woodlanders Lives and Landscapes project, and we're looking at the way that people used to live their lives in the villages in the Chilterns, back in the past, not in the distant past, but maybe in the 19th and 20th centuries. And we've got a series of interviews where people talk actually about what they felt about how it was. And we're very lucky to have an interview with a Mrs. Ethel Warren. She was born in 1901. She was Ethel Maud Stratford. And she was born in Beacon's Bottom, which was about 2.5 miles from Stokenchurch. And she lived in that area pretty well all her life. She was interviewed in 1990 for a really nice local history book called Stokenchurch in Perspective, which unfortunately is now out of print. She obviously had a really great time being interviewed, and she told a lot of funny stories. She was a great laugh. So, as I say, she was born in 1901 in Beacon's Bottom, and you can see in this photograph the cottage that she lived in. On the left-hand side, there are 2 cottages in that one building, and she lived in there, and she lived in Beacon's Bottom throughout her childhood up until about 1913, and then she came back later and lived in the area then as well. Beacon's Bottom is now a pretty small village, and I think it was then, but it had all sorts of facilities in it. And it served other hamlets that were nearby as well. One of those was the school. It was the local council school, and Ethel went to that school until she was 13. That was the leaving age in those days. And at that point she went off and she went to become a servant, first off in Gerrard's Cross and then in Chelsea. And this was a thing that a lot of young women did in those days. There weren't other employment opportunities really. And also her mother was widowed, and she had remarried round about that time, and I think that Ethel maybe found it useful to be able to get away. She was paid about £6 a year, not very much, all in, she got all her food and lodgings, of course, but she had to pay for her uniform out of that, but she didn't seem to mind at all. In fact, she thought it was a pretty happy time, I think. The school, sadly, doesn't function as a school any longer, but the building is there. As you can see in this photograph, it's now a private house. And another of the institutions that was in the village that was much used as a community centre really was the primitive Methodist chapel. And the Stratford family, Ethel's family, were very observant. Her brother George became a preacher, and she, Ethel, used to go to services 3 times on a Sunday, not always willingly. This photograph shows the interior when it was very active. But like the school really, it went into a decline, and in 1971 the building was sold off, and that too has now become a private house, and this is the auction sale advert for it. And Ethel talks about lace making. Now lace making was a big rural industry in the Chilterns, in the villages of the Chilterns, for the women and children particularly in the 19th century. Women would make lace at home. As you can see in this photograph, they'd make it using a big pillow and threads and bobbins, and they'd sit outside their doors to catch the light, because inside the cottages it was pretty dark. They'd make this and they would sell it to a dealer, and they'd get a small amount of money for it. It wasn't a lot of money, but it still made a big contribution, a useful contribution anyway, to the household finances. But this business went into a decline. Competition from machine-made lace completely slaughtered it, and handmade lace was only really for very special things. And so by the time that Ethel was a girl, she didn't go into lace making, but she did remember a couple of women in the village who did make lace, and she tells a story about one of them, which is very funny.
Never did it, but the old people in the village did. There was Fanny Norcott, Mrs. Norcott. She did lace making, used to sit there and sit outside the door, on a chair, doing this. Lace making on the big old pillow.
Now, Fanny Norcott was very, very skilled, wasn't she?
Very what?
Skilled. Because a lady in Stokenchurch told me they brought their patterns to Fanny Norcott to prick them out because she was so good.
Yes.
Is that true?
Yes, that's quite true.
Yes.
Yes, and she was always busy, poor soul, doing lace making that. And there was also another old lady, older than Fanny Norcott, and she lived next door to my mother. But the old cottages have been pulled down.
Yeah.
Time too. Anyway.
Yeah.
Oh. And she used to sit there, just inside her door, and you went down a step to get down there. And she'd sit there in the winter time with the door open, and she'd have a shock pot. Now, this is something that'll make your hair curl. This was a large golden syrup tin full of hot coals, and she put that underneath where she could feel the warmth. And one day, a terrible thing happened. She got these great long petticoats and everything on, red flannel. You thing of beauty and a joy forever. You've never seen anything like it. And she suddenly screamed blue murder. Her petticoat was caught alight, and there she was. And a man was staying in the village, he heard her scream, and he went. He put out this, and after that, he didn't call her Mrs. Ginger. He called her Mrs. Hot Stuff.
But although Ethel clearly enjoyed talking about her childhood, had a whale of a time in the interview, she was absolutely adamant that they were not the good old days. She really wanted to set the record straight and do away with the kind of rosy-cheeked villager idyll that she obviously felt had got a bit of a hold. Times were hard. It was a difficult life, seasonal occupations in agriculture, and not very much money coming in. And times were particularly hard for her family after her father died in 1908. And in this extract, she talks about her mother being, finding it so difficult.
We had a trap door in their bedroom. We had only 2 bedrooms, and they were big.
Yeah.
And I mean, there was 9 of us in family. I was the youngest.
Yeah.
And of course, the older brothers and my older sisters, they'd all left home. And I was the youngest. My brother Harry, at Betty's dad, was 4.5 years older than me. So, of course, I was as welcome as snow in harvest. Oh, no, I wasn't in... Oh, my mother was so fed up with kiddies, and I could understand it. It was damned hard work to try to feed them, especially when you'd got a father who was a drunkard, and eventually, they'd call him an alcoholic today.
Yes.
That's what my mother had to put up with.
Yes.
I've seen that poor old dear sit on the stairs with her apron over her head, crying and saying, "Oh God, what am I going to do?"
Yeah, I can understand it.
Oh, yes. I remember the nitty-gritty. Don't anybody talk to me about the old days. They weren't.
She married in 1920. She married Ethel Warren, and he soon afterwards went to work in a furniture factory in High Wycombe. This was an occupation for a lot of people in this area working in the furniture industry, and he must have had, a reasonable wage. But she says even then it wasn't the good old days. They didn't really have enough food, and she would hold back, make sure that her husband and her children had got enough to eat. But even so, she'd have margarine maybe, and they'd have butter. And she said that she went down at one point to 6 stone, which is 38 kilos. And so, yeah, for her, no, those weren't the good old days. But if you look at this photograph of her and her husband, taken in about 1930, they do look happy. So perhaps not the good old days, but with happy moments.